The Moth Keeper's House. Part 1. The House on Kremble Street. The moving truck groaned to a stop in front of 14 Kremble Street, and 11-year-old Eli Vargas pressed his face against the car window and tried very hard to feel excited. He failed. The house stared back at him. That was the only way to describe it. It stared. 3 stories of dark Victorian wood, with a peaked roof like a witch's hat, and 2 round attic windows that sat side by side like a pair of pale, unblinking eyes. Paint peeled from the shutters in long gray strips, the way dead skin peels after a bad sunburn. The yard was overgrown with tall grass the color of old teeth, and a single oak tree stood in the center of it all, twisted and leafless, despite the fact that it was the middle of September, when every other tree on the street blazed orange and gold. "Oh, it's perfect," Eli's mother said. Eli thought she might need glasses. "It has good bones," she added, pushing open the car door and stepping out with her hands on her hips, the way she always did when she'd already made up her mind about something. Sandra Vargas had been a contractor for 15 years. She saw potential in broken things the way other people saw shapes in clouds. "We'll have it beautiful by spring." Eli climbed out more slowly, dragging his backpack behind him. His sneakers sank into the long grass as he walked toward the front door. And he noticed something then, something that made him stop and look around. Every other yard on Kremble Street was perfectly ordinary. Raked leaves, flower pots, a bicycle left on someone's lawn, a cat sleeping on a porch step. But no moths. Eli wasn't sure why he noticed the moths first. He wasn't even sure in that first moment that moths was the right word for what he was seeing. They were small, smaller than his thumbnail, and they clung to the peeling shutters and the porch railing and the wooden frame of the front door in absolute stillness. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Tan and gray and the palest, dustiest white, their wings folded shut like tiny sleeping hands. They didn't move when Eli's mom walked right past them. They didn't move when the movers started hauling boxes through the front door, banging and clattering and cursing under their breath. They just clung there, patient and waiting, as if they'd been expecting everyone to arrive. Eli counted 37 moths on the front door alone before his mother called him inside. Dash, dash, dash. The house smelled like old wood and something sweeter underneath, something dry and powdery and faintly wrong, like a flower that had been pressed in a book for too long. The ceilings were tall. The wallpaper was dark red with a pattern of climbing roses that had faded almost to brown. Every room had a fireplace that no one had lit in what looked like years. His room was on the 2nd floor at the end of the hall. It was small and square and had a window that looked out onto the oak tree, its bare branches reaching toward the glass like fingers. There was a closet with no doorknob, just a hole where the knob used to be, and a light switch that flickered for a full 3 seconds before the overhead bulb decided to stay on. "We'll get that fixed," his mom said from the doorway. "When?" "Soon." Eli set his backpack on the floor. His mom disappeared back down the hall, already mentally adding the flickering light to her list of things to repair, and Eli stood alone in his new room and listened. The house made sounds. That was normal. Old houses talk to themselves, settling into their foundations, creaking when the wind pushed against them.
Eli knew that, but the sounds in this house weren't quite like settling. They were more like rustling, a dry, papery rustling that moved through the walls in slow, steady waves, starting somewhere above him from the direction of the attic and rolling down through the house like a slow tide. Rustle, rustle, pause, rustle. It's just the pipes, Eli told himself. He looked at the ceiling. The ceiling looked back. That first night, Eli lay in his sleeping bag on the bare mattress his mom had set up while the proper bed frame was still in a box somewhere, and he listened to the house in the dark. The rustling was louder at night. It moved through the walls above his head with a rhythm that was almost like breathing. In and out, in and out. A slow, enormous breath that paused for exactly 4 seconds between each inhale and exhale, as if whatever was breathing up there was very old and very tired and in no particular hurry. Don't be ridiculous, Eli told himself. It's just air in the pipes. It's just settling wood. It's just the wind. He rolled over and pulled the sleeping bag up to his chin. The window was full of moths. He hadn't closed the curtains. There weren't any curtains yet, just the bare window, and the porch light from the house next door bled a faint orange glow across the glass. The moths had found the warmth of that light, and they were pressed against the outside of the window in a solid, shuddering mass, their wings beating against each other so slowly it looked like they were breathing. In and out, in and out. The same rhythm as the rustling in the walls. Eli sat up very quickly. And then he noticed something that made his mouth go dry. In the very center of the window, surrounded by dozens of smaller moths, there was one moth larger than the rest. Its wings were spread wide, wider than any moth Eli had ever seen in a book or at school, and they were pale as paper, almost white. And on those pale wings, in brown and gray markings that were too precise to be an accident, was a face. Not a beautiful face, not a carved or printed face. A real face, with 2 eyes and a nose and a thin, slightly open mouth, rendered in the dusty markings of the wings as clearly as a photograph. The face of a young woman, looking right at him. Eli blinked. The moth folded its wings shut. Just a moth. He lay back down, heart hammering, and didn't sleep for a very long time. Part 2, The Girl Next Door. Priya Mehta was waiting for him in the front yard the next morning, sitting cross-legged on top of the stone wall that separated her yard from his, eating an apple. She had long black hair in a braid down her back, a red jacket, and the direct, slightly assessing expression of someone who had decided to evaluate him before deciding whether to approve. "You moved in," she said. "Yes," said Eli. "Are you staying?" It was such an odd question that Eli just stared at her for a moment. "I mean, yes, we bought the house." Priya took a bite of her apple. She chewed slowly. She looked at the house behind him with an expression he couldn't quite read.
"Lots of people buy the house," she said finally. "Eli's stomach did something complicated."
What does that mean?
Priya jumped down from the wall. She was about his height, maybe an inch shorter, and she had the kind of confidence that made her seem taller.
She extended her hand formally.
"I'm Priya. I've lived next door my whole life. That house," she nodded at 14 Kremble Street, "has had 4 families in the last 7 years. That's not that unusual."
All of them left in winter. She looked at him steadily.
"Usually January, sometimes December, if things moved fast."
What things? Priya bit her apple again. She was quiet for a moment, and Eli had the feeling she was deciding exactly how much to tell him.
"Do you know about the Moth Keeper?" she asked.
The words hit the morning air and seemed to stay there, hanging.
"No," said Eli. "What's a moth keeper?" Priya tilted her head. "My grandmother grew up on this street. She knew the family that originally built this house. A man named Aldous Webb. He moved in back in the 1920s, alone, and he was, well, my grandmother said he was obsessed. He collected moths, thousands of them. He had display cases covering every wall, floor to ceiling. But that wasn't the strange part." "What was the strange part?" "He stopped collecting regular moths eventually, started collecting different ones, special ones." She paused. "He said they spoke to him through their wings." Eli thought of the face he had seen last night. The pale wings spread wide in the glow of the porch light. The thin, slightly open mouth. "He lived alone?" "He lived alone for about a year," said Priya. "And then his sister came to visit, and she moved in. And then she—" Priya stopped. She looked at the house again. "My grandmother said when she last saw the sister, the woman's eyes had gone the wrong color, like the color had been washed out of them. She moved like she was walking in her sleep. She didn't talk much." Priya looked back at Eli. "And then, one day, both of them were just gone. The house was empty, and it's been not quite right ever since." The oak tree in the front yard shifted in the morning wind, its bare branches clicking against each other. "You're trying to scare me," said Eli. "I'm trying to warn you," said Priya. There was no dramatic emphasis in her voice. She said it the way you'd say, "It might rain. You should bring an umbrella." Practical and calm and kind. "There's a difference." She finished her apple. "But okay, you've been warned. Now, do you want to walk to school together? It's 6 blocks. Eli thought about the moths on the window. Thought about the face. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Part 3. The Journal in the Attic. His mother found the door to the attic on the 3rd day. She had been working through the house systematically, the way she always did, cataloging what needed fixing, making lists, taking photographs with her phone. The attic door was at the end of the upstairs hallway, half hidden behind a coat hook and a section of wood paneling that had pulled away from the wall. You had to know to look for it. "Eli, come see," she called. And Eli found her standing in the doorway with her phone flashlight aimed up a steep flight of wooden stairs. The light caught the dust motes drifting down in slow, lazy spirals and lit the bottom of the stairs gold. "I haven't been up yet," she said, with the excitement in her voice that she always got around projects. "Want to explore?" Eli looked up the stairs. The rustling sound was louder here, much louder, a dry, papery whisper that came from everywhere above and around them. "Sure,"
he said, because he didn't want to tell her it scared him. The attic was enormous. The roof peaked high above them. There were old boxes, water-stained and collapsing. A rocking chair in the corner with no cushion. A dressmaker's dummy draped in yellowed cloth. And the cases. They were everywhere, lining the sloping walls, stacked on top of each other, pushed together in clusters on the bare wooden floor. Display cases, dozens and dozens of them, with glass fronts filmed over with dust and wooden frames dark with age. Some were empty, some were not. Eli moved to the nearest case and wiped the glass with his sleeve. Moths. Row after row of moths pinned to velvet backing that had once been dark green and had faded to a sickly gray. They were all sizes, from tiny things the size of his pinky nail to one enormous specimen in the center of the case that spread nearly the full width of the frame, its wings pale white and decorated with markings that, when you looked at them closely. Eli stepped back quickly. Asterisk, a face. Again, a different one this time, a man's face, heavy-browed with deep-set eyes. "Mom," he said, "Mom, look at these." But his mother was already across the attic, kneeling next to a box, pulling out old newspapers and setting them aside in neat piles. "Amazing in here," she called. "Original construction. Look at these rafters, Eli. Hand-hewn. They don't make them like this anymore." Eli turned slowly, looking at the cases. There were faces on all of them. Not all of them were on large moths. Sometimes he had to look carefully, tilting his head, squinting at the pattern of wing markings, before it resolved into a face. But it was always there. Some were clear as photographs. Others were blurred, like a memory of a face rather than the face itself. He counted 11 faces before he found the journal. It was on a low shelf behind the rocking chair, tucked between two empty display cases wrapped in a piece of oilcloth tied with string. The cover, when he unwrapped it, was plain, dark leather. On the inside of the front cover, in a cramped, slanting hand. Property of Aldous J. Webb. Private. Not for other eyes. "Mom," Eli said, "I'm taking this downstairs." "Mm-hmm," she said, not looking up. He slid the journal into his jacket pocket, heart beating quickly, and headed for the stairs. The rustling followed him all the way down. He read it that night, after dinner, by the light of his phone. The journal was 60 pages of increasingly small, increasingly erratic handwriting. Some pages had drawings in the margins, moth wings spread wide, with patterns that Eli was careful not to look at directly. The early pages were scientific, species names, wingspan measurements, notes on breeding habits and feeding patterns. Dry stuff, the kind of thing that would put you to sleep in school. But by page 20, the handwriting changed. It got tighter. The margins got fuller. September 14th, it said, at the top of the page where the change started. "I have discovered something that cannot be explained by anything in my reference books. The moths in this region are not ordinary. I have collected 17 specimens now that carry markings I cannot account for. The patterns are not random. I have measured them, photographed them, compared them with every atlas I own. They are faces, human faces. I know how this sounds. I know how this sounds." Repeated on the next line, underlined. "I know how this sounds. But I have compared specimen G to the tintype photograph of my mother, God rest her, and the resemblance is exact.
down to the scar above her left eyebrow. The moth's left wing, same position, exact dimensions, scaled to the wing. Eli set the journal down for a moment and looked at the window. The moths were there again, clustered on the glass. He was starting to expect them. He picked the journal back up. October 3rd, I have begun to understand the system. The largest moths, the ones I have designated keepers, appear at night, always alone, always at the window closest to where a person sleeps. The next morning, the person is different. It is difficult to explain different. They are still themselves. They answer to their name. They eat, they speak. But something is quieter, less present, as if a lamp inside them has been turned down one notch. November 22nd. My housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott, refused to return to work this week. She says the house makes her feel watched from inside the walls. I dismissed her. I cannot have anyone disrupting my work now that I am so close to understanding. December 1st Street. I think I understand now what the keeper moths do. They don't simply carry faces on their wings. They collect faces. They go to sleeping people and they take something, a memory, a feeling, a piece of what makes a person themselves, and they carry it back to the nest. The person wakes up not quite remembering what was taken. After enough nights, enough visits, there is very little left. Eli's hands were cold. December 9th, I have found the nest. It is in the walls, throughout the walls, a honeycomb structure of papery silk that runs through the entire house like a second skeleton. I cannot remove it. Every time I tear a section away, it is rebuilt overnight. The moths are faster than I can work. The most terrible thing. I found a face on a new moth last night. A face I recognized immediately. It was mine. The journal ended there, not with a final entry, just a sentence that trailed off, as if Aldous Webb had set down his pen to attend to something and never picked it up again. Eli closed the journal. From above him, the rustling in the walls sighed and shifted. Part 4. The Changing. His mother came down to breakfast on a Saturday morning, 4 weeks after they'd moved in, and she was humming. That was normal enough. His mother often hummed while she made coffee. But as Eli watched her move around the kitchen, he realized the tune she was humming wasn't any song he recognized. It wasn't even quite a song. It was more like a sound, a repetitive, flat drone, like a single note played on an instrument with no resonance. "Mom," he said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were lighter than he remembered. Not by much, barely a shade, but his mother had dark brown eyes, warm as coffee, and these eyes were diluted, as if someone had added water. "Good morning," she said, and smiled at him. And it was the right smile, exactly right, the one that reached her eyes and put a crease in her left cheek. "You're being ridiculous," Eli told himself. Eyes don't change color. He watched her pour her coffee. Her hands were steadier than usual. His mother had always been a little restless, tapping her fingers, shifting her weight, always thinking about the next thing. Now she moved as if she had all the time in the world. Slow and calm and careful. Something is quieter, less present, as if a lamp inside them has been turned down one notch. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. "Oh, beautifully," she said.
I've been sleeping so well in this house."
"Better than I have in years." She looked at him over her coffee mug, and for just a moment her eyes did something strange. They drifted, going slightly unfocused, like a camera searching for something to lock onto. Then they refocused. "Are you hungry? I can make eggs."
"I already ate," Eli said, though he hadn't.
He went to find Priya.
Dash, dash, dash. She was in her backyard, raking leaves into a pile with aggressive efficiency. She looked up when Eli climbed the wall between their yards, and her expression shifted from neutral to sharp in an instant.
"What happened?"
He told her everything. The journal, the faces.
The nest, his mother's lighter eyes and her slowed-down movements, and the drone she'd been humming. Priya was quiet for a long time when he finished. "Have you looked at the moths?" she asked. "The ones on your window at night. Have you looked at the wing patterns?"
Eli thought about this. "I saw a face the first night, a woman I didn't know, and in the attic, on the display cases. But have you looked at the ones that have been coming since you moved in?"
The new ones. He hadn't. He'd been too unsettled to look carefully.
"Tonight," Priya said, "look at them."
Dash, dash, dash. He looked that night. He turned off every light in his room and sat on the windowsill with his phone, and he waited for them to come. They arrived just after midnight. The small ones first, a constellation of tan and gray wings assembling on the glass from out of the dark, clustering together until the entire window was a soft, shuddering tapestry of wings.
Then the larger ones came, settling in the center, wings spreading wide.
Eli took photographs, close up, with the flash off so the light from the street could give him what he needed. He looked at the photos for a long time. The first large moth, the one he'd seen on his first night, had a face he still didn't recognize. An older woman, sharp cheekbones, serious eyes. The second large moth, which had arrived more recently, had a face with softer features. Rounded cheeks, dark eyes. His mother's face. Not exactly. The markings were simplified, like a portrait by someone who'd only seen her once or twice and was working from memory. But the shape of her jaw, the line of her nose, the slight asymmetry of her smile, it was her. Or a piece of her. Eli pressed his back against the wall, away from the window, and thought very hard. The moths were taking something from his mother. Whatever it was, they were carrying it back to the nest. And if the nest was throughout the walls of the house, if it had been there since Aldous Webb's time, 100 years of silk and papery cells threaded through the bones of the house like a second, hidden system, then the only way to stop it was to find the heart of it and destroy it. But where? He reopened the journal. The nest is in the walls, throughout the walls, a honeycomb structure of papery silk that runs through the entire house like a second skeleton. Papery silk. Silk from moths. He thought about how moth silk was different from spider silk, how moths built cocoons, how a nest of thousands of moths would build and layer their silk over decades, centuries, until... He stopped. I have found the nest. The attic. Aldous Webb had found the nest. And then he had stopped writing, which meant the attic was where the heart of it was. The center. The original place. And his mother went up to the attic every day to work on the renovation. Part 5. What hides in the walls? Eli told Priya the next morning, standing at the wall between their yards, speaking quickly and quietly. We need to go up there, he said.
Together. I don't want to go alone.
Priya didn't hesitate. Tonight?
My mom goes to bed early now, 9 o'clock. She never used to go to bed before 11. He hated saying it out loud, hated how it made his voice go tight. She'll be asleep.
Okay, said Priya. I'll tell my parents I'm sleeping over at a friend's house.
Are you sure?
She gave him the look that meant she'd already decided.
Obviously.
They went up at 10:15. The house was dark and quiet, the only sound his mother's deep, even breathing from behind her closed bedroom door and the eternal rustling in the walls.
Priya had brought a flashlight, a real one, not just her phone, and its beam cut through the attic stairs in a strong white bar as they climbed. The attic was different at night. In the day, it was dusty and strange and full of old things. At night, it was alive. The rustling was everywhere. A dry, whispering presence that moved through the wooden walls and across the bare floor and up through the soles of Eli's shoes, a vibration more felt than heard. The moth display cases lined the walls in the flashlight beam, hundreds of pinned wings shifting slightly in the air they disturbed as they entered.
There are so many, Priya whispered, sweeping the beam across the cases. There are faces on all of them, Eli said. The big ones.
Priya moved the flashlight more slowly.
She looked at one moth, then another. Then she said, very quietly, Eli, I think I recognize some of these.
What?
This one. She pressed her finger against the glass of a large display case, pointing at a moth with wide, pale wings decorated in a clear, unmistakable portrait. A round-faced, older man with deep-set eyes and a close-trimmed beard.
That's Mr. Hartley. He lived in this house 2 families ago. And this one, she moved to the next case.
This woman. She came to a block party once when I was little. She was the family before him.
How many are there? Eli breathed.
I don't know. Priya's voice was steady, but just barely.
But these aren't just Aldous Webb's moths. He's been collecting this whole time. The moths have been collecting for him. Whoever stayed in this house, they took pieces of them, brought them back here, and he pinned them up. She looked at Eli. Like a collection of people. The rustling in the walls intensified, as if in answer. The heart of the nest, Eli said. We need to find it, the journal said.
I know what the journal said. I read it after you told me about it. Priya shone the flashlight toward the back of the attic, where the slope of the roof came down lowest and the shadows were deepest.
If I were building a nest, I'd put the center at the furthest point, the most protected point.
They moved toward the back.
Behind the dressmaker's dummy, behind a stack of empty boxes they had to shift aside, behind a section of wall that didn't quite meet the floor, there was a gap. Not a door, not anything that had been designed. Just a place where 2 wall panels had pulled apart from each other, leaving a gap about the width of a shoulder, leading into a space behind the wall. You hear that? Priya said. Eli heard it. The rustling, which had been everywhere, was loudest here, loudest and rhythmic, synchronized, a steady pulse like the world's slowest heart. And there was something else now, underneath the sound, a warmth that came from the gap, a soft and cloying warmth that smelled of powdered wings and old silk and something almost sweet. We have to go in, Eli said. Priya handed him the flashlight. You first, it's your house. The space behind the wall was narrow, just wide enough to turn sideways and shuffle forward, with the ceiling sloping inches above his head.
The beam of the flashlight showed him walls of something that was not wood.
It was silk, layers and layers of it, pressed and dried and layered again over decades until it was thick as plaster, covering every surface. A gray-white lining that muffled sound and light and made the space feel like the inside of a cocoon.
The inside of a cocoon.
The thought hit Eli like cold water. He moved the flashlight forward, deeper into the passage. They were there in the walls.
Not moths, not exactly moths, not anymore.
They were shapes in the silk. Rounded shapes, the size of a person. Pressed into the layered walls of the nest, cocooned in gray silk, were figures, human-shaped figures, barely visible beneath the gray, with faces that were covered and still.
Eli counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
5 figures, wrapped in silk, pressed into the walls of the nest like specimens in the world's most terrible display case. He couldn't tell if they were breathing. He didn't want to know.
Eli! Priya's voice came from behind him, strained and very quiet.
Eli, there's something at the end. He turned the flashlight forward. At the far end of the narrow passage, the walls opened into a small chamber. And in the center of the chamber, mounted on a shelf of layered silk as elaborately structured as a throne, was the nest. It was the size of a large suitcase, and it glowed. Not with light. It didn't emit any light exactly, but in the way that deep darkness sometimes seems to glow, the way the center of something vast appears to pulse with its own energy. It was gray-white and perfectly formed, a dense, layered structure of papery silk cells arranged in concentric rings, and from its center emanated the heartbeat pulse of the rustling sound, slow and vast and very old. Pinned around it, fanned out like a display, were moths. Dozens of them, the largest he'd ever seen, each one with wings spread and showing a face.
A gallery of faces, men and women, and children and people so aged it was hard to tell.
Faces in every stage of clarity, some sharp as photographs, some blurred to near formlessness.
And in the very center of the display, wings spread wider than any of the others, pinned above the nest itself, a face Eli knew.
Not his mother, not yet. It was a face that matched the photograph on the inside back cover of the journal. A long face with deep-set eyes and a precise, unhappy mouth. Aldous Webb.
Not a portrait of him. Not an image taken from a photograph.
Aldous Webb, pinned there on the largest moth, was the center of the collection. He had thought he was the keeper. He had never understood that he was the collection. Part 6. The Keeper Comes. The rustling stopped. Eli and Priya both went completely still. In the sudden silence, they could hear, very clearly, a sound from the attic above them, a slow, dragging step. And then another, and then the creak of the stairs. Someone was coming down from the attic. No, someone was already in the attic. Someone had come up the attic stairs while they were inside the walls. "Mom!" Eli breathed. He pushed back through the narrow gap into the attic, with Priya right behind him, and found his mother standing in the center of the floor. She was barefoot, still in her pajamas. Her eyes were open, but they were wrong. The color drained almost completely now, a pale gray-brown like river water in winter, and they were fixed on the gap in the wall with an expression that wasn't quite an expression at all. She was breathing slowly and evenly, and she didn't seem to see Eli at all. "Mom!" He stepped toward her. "Mom, wake up!" She didn't respond.
"She's sleepwalking," Priya said from behind him.
"I know." Eli reached out and touched his mother's arm, and his hand recoiled. She was cold. Not just cool, cold, with the deep, settled cold of something that has been that way for hours, a coldness that went past the skin. And as he touched her, she turned without waking, without changing expression, and began to walk toward the gap in the wall. "No!" Eli stepped in front of her. She stopped. She stood completely still for a long moment. And then her head turned very slowly toward Eli's face, and her colorless eyes focused on him, not quite focused, not quite seeing him, but aimed at him with the terrible precision of something that was using her as a vehicle, using his mother's body to look at him through her eyes. The rustling began again, louder than it had ever been, a roar of dry wings filling every wall of the house. "The nest," Priya said from behind him, her voice shaking. "Eli, if you destroy the nest—" "I know." He didn't look away from his mother's face. "Mom, I know you can hear me in there somewhere. I know you're in there." His throat was tight. His eyes were burning. He blinked hard, once. "Don't move. Just stay still." He turned. He ran back to the gap in the wall. Part 7. The Heart of the House. Inside the passage, the warmth had intensified. It pressed against him like a second skin. That cloying sweetness, and the nest pulsed in the small chamber at the end, its rhythm fast now, not a slow heartbeat anymore, but something urgent and close, a rapid flutter like the beating of 100 wings in a closed hand. Eli moved toward it. The moths on the walls were awake. Dozens of them, moving, crawling up the silken walls toward the ceiling, wings opening and closing. The faces in their wings moved with them, and for a terrifying second, Eli thought he saw the faces move, saw lips part and eyes shift before he forced himself to look only at the nest itself and not at the walls around him. He reached out toward the nest. The warmth hit him like a wave, and he almost staggered. It wasn't a physical warmth, not quite, but something that reached inside him and grabbed at something he didn't have a name for. A feeling, a memory, his mother's laugh, his father's voice, the smell of the apartment they'd lived in before, of old books and takeout containers, and the particular quality of light on Sunday mornings. Let go, something seemed to suggest, from everywhere at once. You can put it all down. You don't have to carry any of it. You can rest. Eli felt his hands go loose. He felt the tension go out of his shoulders. He felt the cold begin. "Eli!" Priya's voice from the gap in the wall, sharp and frightened and real. He grabbed the nest with both hands and pulled. It resisted. It was heavier than it looked, dense with 100 years of silk. And it pulled back against him as if rooted to the shelf. And the roaring in the walls became a shriek, a high, thin, inhuman sound that Eli felt in his teeth and the backs of his eyes, and the moths on the walls burst into motion, a storm of wings in the narrow passage, battering against him, against his arms and face and hair. He pulled again and again. Crack! The nest came away from the wall with a sound like tearing paper, and Eli fell backward, clutching it to his chest, and the shrieking rose to a pitch that was no longer sound at all, and was more like the world holding its breath. And then it stopped. In the instant of silence, Eli could hear his own heartbeat. He looked down at the nest in his hands. It was already crumbling, the edges going gray and dry and powdering away, the silken cells collapsing into themselves, the layers dissolving into a fine gray dust that drifted down through the air of the passage and settled on everything. In his hands, in less than a minute, the nest fell to pieces, less than pieces, to dust, to nothing, until he was holding only a faint smudge of gray powder against his palms. The moths on the walls were still. He looked at the figures in the silk, the 5 cocooned shapes pressed into the walls. As he watched, the silk around them dissolved the same way the nest had, cell by cell, layer by layer, falling away in slow sheets of gray. In a few minutes, the walls were bare wood. The figures were gone. Where they had been, the wood was new, fresh, as if the space had just been built. He pushed out of the gap and back into the attic. Part 8. After. His mother was standing exactly where he'd left her, but her eyes were closed. As Eli watched, she swayed slightly, the way a person sways when they're drifting between sleeping and waking, and her face changed. The blankness left it. The pale severity dissolved, and underneath it, appearing slowly like a sun coming out from behind clouds, was his mother's face. Her actual face, with the small furrow between her brows that appeared when she was thinking, and the slight downward curve of her mouth that meant she was about to have a feeling she hadn't expected. Her eyes opened, dark brown, warm as coffee. She blinked twice. She looked at the attic around her, the cases, the boxes, the peaked ceiling, with the confused expression of someone waking up somewhere unexpected. She looked at Eli. "Eli?" She rubbed her eyes. How did I?" She looked down at her bare feet, at the dust on the attic floor. "Did I sleepwalk up here?" "Yeah," said Eli. His voice cracked. He crossed the attic in 4 steps and hugged her, and she made a surprised sound and then hugged him back, tight and real and warm. I'm sorry," she said, confused. "I had the strangest dreams. I kept dreaming about. I can't even remember now. Something about wings." Priya was standing at the top of the stairs, watching them both. She met Eli's eyes over his mother's shoulder. He mouthed, "Thank you." She shook her head. "Don't thank me. Go." He helped his mother back downstairs. She went to bed easily, murmuring that she must need to sleep, that the renovation was more tiring than she thought. Within minutes, she was breathing deeply, and when Eli leaned over her in the dark, her eyes were still. He went back up to the attic. Dash, dash, dash. He and Priya spent the next hour and a half taking down every display case and stacking them by the attic stairs. Tomorrow, he would tell his mother they needed to be thrown out. They were old and broken, he'd say, and would take up valuable renovation space. He didn't think he'd need to explain further. Priya held the flashlight while he worked. "The 5 people in the walls," he said, as he lifted the last case down. "The ones cocooned." "I know," said Priya. Her voice was thoughtful and sad. "They were already gone, weren't they? The moths had taken everything." "But the silk dissolved.
They're not in there anymore. No. She was quiet for a moment.
I think the moths were keeping them, preserving what was left of them. When the nest dissolved, they dissolved too.
Eli thought about Aldous Webb, pinned at the center of his own collection. How he'd set out to understand something extraordinary and ended up as its trophy. He thought about the journal, I know how this sounds, written by a man who had no idea that the thing he was studying him right back.
He thought he was in control, Eli said.
They always do, said Priya. Eli set down the last display case. He looked at the bare attic wall, where the gap between the panels had sealed itself shut the same way the nest had dissolved, silently, invisibly, leaving only clean wood behind.
Do you think it's really over? He asked.
Priya considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. I think the nest is gone, she said, carefully. I think the moths that were carrying faces, they're gone too. The ones outside, the regular ones, they'll probably leave. She looked at the window. But the house is still the house. What does that mean? It means be careful. She picked up her flashlight. It means that someone built that nest over 100 years, and even if the nest is gone, this house was shaped by it for all that time. Houses remember things. Eli looked around the attic, at the bare walls, the old boxes, the rocking chair in the corner.